Okay, so this is our welcome just before we're ready to start. Our professional development today is Jerrel Horn from the Library Course Reserves. Is that I'm sure that's not your official title. Huh?
No, my official title is Senior Library Technical Assistant.
Ooh,
I work in circulation, access services, and among other things that we take care of is course reserves.
Okay, all right. And based on an opportunity I had this summer working with a faculty member, we came to the realization that course reserves is something that most of us probably don't know anything about, or at least very little, and decided that it was something that we needed to offer for our faculty. And so we invited Jerrel to come in and talk to us. The slide we have up right now is 3 different interactive pieces that you will see as she goes through her session. So are we on?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So I will turn it over to Jerrel.
Okay. Welcome. I'm glad everyone can make it. As you were told, I'll be talking to you about course reserves and what it is and what you can use it for, and some of the issues we've come across with doing course reserves. So let's get going. Now, what I'm going to be telling you about is telling you what course reserves is, why it's a good idea to use it, and how it works. We'll be going over what kinds of services we offer, the things that we can do for you, and especially talking about how course reserves deals with copyright, since that's becoming a very big issue for universities. Now, before we go on, I should say I'm not the only person in the course reserves department. There is another person that runs it. We run it jointly. Her name is Nikki Worrell. And at the end of the presentation, there's some handouts that you can print for yourself, among which is contact information for any questions.
Plus, we're going to be doing another library session in November on copyright issues too, so that we can go into more depth on that.
Yes, I highly encourage you to go to that session, mainly because that's going to get into a lot of depth of why copyright is something we all need to be concerned about, especially working at the universities now. So the first question is, what do you know about course reserves? So if you want to go into the Padlet and type in some ideas of what you think it is, or does, or just anything you think about it. Okay, so we've got a question about reserving textbooks for students. One that's kind of varied.
I'll move it. Well, I think I will. Maybe I will.
You can scroll down.
Oh, gotcha. Thank you.
Well, one where someone admits they haven't really used it much. It seems like we got some idea, at least, of what course reserves is. So we'll go on and go into it in some more detail.
So we need to get back to this, right?
And these Padlets will remain up. I won't be taking them down. So you're welcome to add comments throughout the session and later if you'd like. They're very helpful. Okay. So.
Oops, sorry.
Oops. Okay.
We're doing it together. I'll let you.
All right.
I'll let you drive.
Okay. So, what is course reserves? In a nutshell, it's a system that makes materials, print, media, online, and anything else we can get creative about, available to students through the library. So, why should professors use it? Well, for the 2 top reasons would be that it saves students money. Right now, FAU is under a mandate, and not just FAU, but universities in general are under a mandate to try to find some way to bring down the cost of course materials, especially textbooks. That's a whole other rant we could get into in another time. It does also save you a lot of time and effort. I've going to school here myself, and I've had professors that have made materials available through the department office. The problem is now they have to track them, make them available, know who has it, who's bringing it back. You can only go when the office is open. It just ends up becoming a nightmare. It gives you a lot more options, and we'll get into that when we talk about a lot of the services we offer. And we're more than willing to be creative and come up with ideas to help you with what you're trying to do for your class. It improves accessibility. Course Reserves is available for the materials when the library is open. The library is open every day of the week. The only exceptions are a few days during intersession and the week that FAU is closed at Christmas. So students can come up to 2 in the morning during the week, for instance, to check out course material things when the department office has been closed since 5 in the afternoon. And most importantly, we handle copyright permissions. And we'll get into more about that in a little while. So, what can you place on Course Reserves? Well, that's one idea, something that you want your students to read or see or do something with. One of the reasons why I chose this background is that we can do pretty much anything on Course Reserves with certain limitations. So theoretically, if you had a basket, for instance, because you were teaching about some sort of anthropology course, you could place that on Course Reserves if we could make the proper arrangements. We've had materials that from places you wouldn't think about on Course Reserves at different times.
Nice.
There are considerations that we have, and we'll get into that, but as far as what it is, there's really no real limitation. All right, well, we'll let you think about that while we continue on. Okay, so here I've listed some of the things you can place on there. Books, of course, articles. We do paper articles, although there isn't really a call for that too much anymore. But we also do online articles of all sorts, book chapters, media, music, film, any sort of media, links to items. So, I mean, pretty much anything that's publicly available on the internet. And as I said, we get into the copyright with that. We can put on their personal resources. We've had professors place comic books on reserve. We've had items from the Jaffe collection on reserve. So, I mean, as I said, if it were something like this, we probably couldn't handle it. But if it's something we can handle, we can probably figure out something we can do with it. And even special collection materials, although the star there is because we do have to evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. Our main concern is just making sure the material doesn't get lost or ruined somehow by all the handling. But don't be afraid to ask. As I said, we've had some very interesting things placed on reserves.
And the book chapter thing is how I came to get acquainted with Jerrel, because I had someone who had some chapters of some books that she wanted her students to read in order to do an activity in class, and a variety of different ones. And we all know that we can't copy them over to post them. And so we had the opportunity to meet and work with Jerrel and get it all set up for her. And it really has worked out beautifully for her.
Now, there are some things we cannot reserve, and this is getting into those conditions I've talked about. If we don't have copyright permission for the item, this mainly applies to copies of things. So, for instance, if you had a copy of a book that you wanted to place on reserve, we would have to make sure that you had permission to do it. You were the author and own the permission, or however you got that permission, especially for online materials. Things that have complex copyright permission requirements where we have to go and get that permission. This especially applies to media, where we have to purchase a license to be able to have the item on reserve. It's happened a couple of times where somebody's asked about something like that. It's rare, but it sometimes happens. The only way you can get access to the item is by purchasing, say, a year license to get access to it. Or they create too much liability. Examples here would be you borrow items, because those aren't owned by FAU or the person placing it on reserve. There are exceptions though. One professor did get permission to do that. They went out and got the permission from the library that owned the book, and the library said it's fine, so we did it. We had permission. The same thing with interlibrary loan. Where this actually came up for me personally was this issue I was talking about earlier about access. One of the classes I took required you to do lab work on your own time. The problem was the lab had to be locked because of the equipment in it. And the department office had the key. This was before we finally got the card swipes. Trying to get the key was a nightmare. The problem is if the key was lost, it would have created even more of a nightmare because of how the access that keys have here at FAU. So that was not something we were able to put on reserve. So believe me, I looked into it.
So you didn't put the key on reserve then?
No, I'm afraid not. Because it would have then escalated into rekeying locks and all sorts of other issues. So you wanted to reserve something, we say, ooh, we have a problem with that. We need to talk. So what can you do? Well, you can speak to a reference librarian to see if there's other things that you could use, like Rachel, that would suit your purposes and that we can place on reserve.
Can I inject something into that?
Sure.
With specific, we can create like a handout with the specific instructions catered to whatever the resource is, so that it's, you know, if it's an article or an e-journal where you just want them accessing certain journals, or if you want instructions for how to find articles on a topic within a database, we can cater it depending on what the situation is.
So that's something aside from the LibGuide?
Yeah, I mean, it could be part of a LibGuide, or it could be just a handout that gets embedded into the Blackboard environment.
Believe me, we're very flexible in what we can do, and we're very creative.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another solution is ask us, that's the library that is, to purchase the item. If it's an ebook, now we can put a link in course reserves, the library owns the book, students have access 24/7.
Would it be certain, like if it's the ebook, it'd be one book that can only be accessed one student at a time?
No, the library, when they purchase ebooks, does their best to actually own the book outright, so that as many students as necessary can access the ebook. Some accesses, there are limitations, but they say what those are up front, like 10 students can access at a time, and then when they're done, another 10 can go in. So they're pretty flexible.
Wow.
Well, I think a lot of our ebooks are either one person at a time or 3 people at a time. So it depends on the ebook. So you may want to either check out, you know, take a look at that ebook online yourself, or contact us and ask about that particular resource, or come meet with us, or have us come to you.
So that would be part of that initial conversation. This is something I want my students to have access to. What are my options?
Yeah, because although we try to own the ebook outright, not all of them are available that way. But that doesn't mean that there isn't access. You may just have to be a little bit patient. Just as if the physical materials were on reserve. You know, if somebody had it checked out, you have to wait for them to return it to check it out yourself.
Well, we have an online question.
Could the ebook be a required course textbook, or?
Depends on what the book is. For instance, we actually have quite a few required course textbooks for the sciences because they're also the best reference books for those subjects. If you can make the case that the library should own the book, the library will purchase the book. One book in particular I can think of is used for electromagnetism. It's about 50 years old now, 60 years old actually,
Wow.
and it's still the book for that subject. And so therefore the library has a copy, even though it's also the textbook for the course. So just because it's a textbook doesn't mean we won't get it.
But it would also, it's not as this book is in the library, so my students don't have to buy it, right?
No.
We have a policy
Yeah.
that, we don't, as a matter of habit, buy textbooks because we just can't afford to do that and then also get things that people need for their research. So it would have to be a special request, but we do have a request form for purchases that we could always, send people the link to or, turn people to. And then once it's purchased, arrangements could then be made with Jerrel to get it as a course reserve item.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically, if it's just simply that you're trying to give your students a break, well, there's other ways we can work with that. But if it's a book that is a really core book to what you're teaching in general, that's a different matter. And we're definitely willing to talk and listen to your case.
Always.
Always, definitely. And the same would go for, videos, physical books, any of those. For instance, we have a display going on right now or a display we're working on for African American History Month, talking about, part of it we'll be talking about some of the libraries in Africa. And one of those, it's a fascinating story, which I'm not going to get into right now. There was a video made by the BBC Corporation. The libraries purchased streaming rights to it for 3 years. And because I made the case, this was a good thing to have, to go with a project that we're working on. Another thing you can do is ask for the pages you really need. Maybe you don't need the whole article or the whole chapter, you just need a few select pages. The rest of it is fine, but it's more background material, and there's other ways to deliver that information. Or you could contact the copyright holder directly. I had a professor that did that. We ended up with rights to it for a year. We didn't need it, but that's what they gave us, and they did it for free. So that always works too. And what it comes down to is talk to us. We're full of ideas and instances and things people have come up with to try to get around the problem or solve it or just something to help you out so you get what you need. Now, here's the big question. How does course reserves work? And I should point out the reason why I chose this is that woman there is Hypatia. You could call her the patron saint of female scientists. She was a mathematician, a philosopher, and astronomer who was killed simply because she wanted to learn. Ooh. Yeah. But if she can have that kind of dedication, I think we can too. Anyway, this is how it works. First, you choose what you want to place on course reserves and talk to us if you need to. Then you fill out the course reserves form. We have an online version and a physical copy you can come into the library to get. And don't worry, we have links to all of the online stuff later on in the presentation. You set whatever restrictions you want on checking the item out. You want it to be for only a couple of hours. You want it to be for several days. You want it to leave the library. You don't want it to leave the library. And we can talk about that. Then, if it's a physical item, you bring it to circulation desk. If it's an online, you can send us your syllabus, your reading syllabus, or send us the PDF or whatever it is so that we have the actual material. If necessary, we can also do some copying, so we'll get into that. We research the copyright permission if it's necessary. So as Judy was mentioning about the book chapters, that was one of the things we had to do was look into if we could get copyright permission and how much it would cost and so forth, and we let you know. And then finally, at the end of the semester, we remove everything and return it to you. Or you can come pick it up, whichever is easier. Now, here's the first of the links I was talking about. The faculty guidelines are located here at these links for media reserves. That would be videos and music, mainly, and everything else. We take care of books, CD-ROMs, pretty much anything else you can think of, and all of the online stuff. Now, the information includes our policies and guidelines, so a lot of your questions would be answered there. How to have the library purchase a book or other item for course reserves, and links to the online request forms. So that's definitely a good page to bookmark. So, how can we help you? Yes, it's not that it's not intuitive, it's a little more straightforward than that.
That's great.
By the way, this is a great strip if you want to look at it. It's at unshelved.com. Our main services are that we can pull items from the library shelves, and we can also get them from the other libraries that are in our system. So you don't have to go up to Jupiter or wherever to try and get it. We will do all that work for you. We research the copyright permission, and we can create PDFs of articles and chapters for e-reserves if necessary. Other services we offer is that if you have any questions about copyright status, we can help you with basic information. We can research to see if special requests to figure out if they can be placed or how we can get your request accomplished. We can gather online course readings into one place. I had one professor who was actually out in San Francisco teaching a distance learning class, and she must have had, I think, about 40 readings. And the point of the class wasn't teaching them how to do research, it was teaching other things with nursing. And so we put everything in one place for her, so her students at least didn't have to do that step of trying to do the research to find all this information. We can also, as I said, copy articles and book chapters. And we can do, one of the things we've started is doing what's called departmental course reserves. That's where departments will often get books that all of the students in that major can use. And rather than the department running the loaning of the books, we can do it for you.
I have a question.
Yes.
So what would the student look up under course reserves when they're searching for that?
What they would look up, and it's detailed in the student course reserves guidelines, which are at the end of the presentation. If it's an item for your class, they would look up by your last name. Otherwise, for departmental, for instance, they would look up by the department name. And we can send you the instructions for how your students can find your materials if necessary. One example of departmental course reserves that we've started is for the accounting department. And they've placed the test books for the various accounting tests on reserves for their students, and they've been updating them every year. So that's just one example.
So would those things, the departmental ones, stay on reserve?
Yeah, they stay on what we call permanent reserve, and I will get to that in just a moment.
Sorry.
Actually, now is as good a time to say, since we brought it up. Permanent reserve is something we will do if the item is going to be used again and again and again. It needs to have to be used every semester for the same class, or at least get the class information updated. We have a music professor, for instance, that teaches a basic music course, history of music course. And she has a collection of books and CDs that have been on reserve for, oh gosh, probably about 8 years now, because she teaches the same class every semester. And we have several other professors that have started doing that as well. All we need is updated permission every semester to keep the items on reserve. Departmental, it's a little different. In that case, we just need yearly permission to do it. So we can definitely be flexible with your needs with that. And we'd love to have this stuff. I mean, it's great for the students. So if there's something you'd like us to do, please ask. I mean, I'm sure you've got ideas we haven't even thought of that we can do with reserves. I mean, we've basically got the library's inventory systems, really what it amounts to, ready for you to use. You don't need to recreate the wheel.
I have a question.
Yes.
A faculty member of mine just wrote the textbook for their course.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried to keep it at a price point that was relatively inexpensive, for the student. And she was talking to me about getting a copy for the library, but the downside could be that the revenue, the small amount of revenue that you could generate from selling the textbooks would be further, kind of diminished by keeping a course copy on reserve. Can you speak to that at all?
Actually, I can see why she would think that. As it turns out, and I'll be honest, it's mainly because of pure laziness. It doesn't happen.
Yeah, students.
Mainly because all you have to do is make sure the book is available only at the library, that they cannot take it home, which means they have to come to the library to read it. You'll get maybe 1 or 2 students that are that dedicated. Most of them aren't. When they come to the library for a textbook, we get 2 requests. One, they want to check it out for the semester, take home and use. That we really can't accommodate. We'd love to, but we can't. The other is, I left it at home, I needed my classes in an hour, I just need to look through something. That we're more than happy to help with. And that's usually what people come to us for textbooks for, is that they just want to sit down and look through it for a little bit.
A second part to that other one is it hasn't arrived at the bookstore yet.
That happened, yeah.
A lot.
Yes. Another thing students will sometimes do is that they will get, especially if the textbook is coming out with new editions, they'll get a slightly older edition, but the problems are different. So all they want are the problems. They don't need the whole thing. They've already spent their money for it. So as I said, losing money on it really doesn't happen, mainly because the only way the student would want to use the textbook for the whole class and not buy it is if they could use it for the whole class. They are not going to come to the library every day to look at it. Again, you may get 1 or 2, they're the exception to the rule, but that it just doesn't happen.
And from my perspective, this whole slide and image, if there's something you'd like us to do, please ask, seems to be the philosophy of everybody in the library. I haven't met anybody that hasn't been accommodating, no matter how far-fetched my questions are. It's amazing. It's an amazing group of people up there.
You could say you don't get into library sciences unless you have almost a pathological need to help.
Well, that's why we're going to teaching, though, too.
Yeah.
Yes.
You don't go into it for the money.
Right. Yeah.
No.
Especially these days.
We actually had a student come to the desk and ask some questions about why the library wasn't doing certain things that would cost money, and we had to explain, well, it would cost money and we would have to hire. You mean you don't work here for free?
Almost.
Almost.
Yeah.
No, she was serious.
Oh, no.
She thought we volunteered.
Oh, my.
I didn't tell her that we probably would if our other expenses are covered, but that's another story. Okay, so we've gone through course reserves. Now we come to copyright and why we should worry about it. So please don't be like Alfred E. Newman. Worry about it. Now I should add, I have this disclaimer in here. I am not a lawyer. I will give you the information that I have, but it does not substitute for legal counsel. And I'll tell you right now, and this is totally serious, a very big and growing field in library science is librarians that also have the Juris Doctorate, simply to deal with copyright. As a matter of fact, I just saw a position opening up, I think it's for North Carolina University, for a librarian that is also a lawyer to deal with these copyright issues because they're becoming so big. And the simple answer is the reason why is the internet. Before the internet, if you violated copyright, yes, people cared. Were they going to find you? Not likely. Were they going to waste time finding you? Not likely. It wasn't worth it. With the internet, it's become so easy. They're now starting to go after even picky things when it comes to copyright. Now, part of the problem with copyright law is if you actually go in and read it, it's great for when you have insomnia, I'll tell you that. It's actually very readable. The problem is it goes through what you can't do and only a few situations of what you can't do. It does not address what you can do other than fair use. And then it's Well, here's fair use, and you have to decide if it's fair use or not. Gee, thanks. Now, there are 4 criteria that the courts have come up with in defining what is fair use and what isn't, but it's still very vague. But before we go any further, though, I should define what fair use is. Fair use permits the unlicensed use of copyrighted works in certain circumstances. It's directly from the definition. Now, here's the reason why it's deliberately vague. Fair use is governed by case law. That's why you need to be a lawyer to understand it. Because not only do you need to know all the cases that have applied, you need to know why the decisions were made, and based on all of that, what decisions are likely to be made in the future.
Okay, question, Jerrel, then.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying is the whole concept of fair use has been, every time something comes, a court case comes up, it just adds to that?
Yes,
And
it
that's
adds to
the
the body
only-
of law of fair use.
Ooh,
Now, I will tell you, there is a movement abroad to
That's a
fix
slow
that problem.
process.
Yes, there is a movement to fix that problem, but you know how politics are. These movements take a lot of time, and it will probably need to reach a tipping point before people get fed up enough to fix it. In the meantime, we're stuck with what we've got. So, in the spirit of that, I have a third Padlet where you can tell me what you think you're allowed to do in the classroom. This would be in the physical classroom, the online classroom, anywhere you're teaching. What have you heard that you can do? Or what have you done that you believe is legal? All right, well, this question I think kind of gets to the heart of it, is that I'm sure you've all heard, I've heard the same thing, you can use some parts of things for a small part of time. Well, yes and no and maybe not. Is that a good enough answer?
Yep.
Basically, what it boils down to, and Jane Strudel will definitely get into a lot more detail on this to give you the tools to make these decisions for yourself, is that if you're, say, a student gets a book out of the library and copies a chapter for their own use, that is automatic fair use, as long as it's one chapter in a small part of the book. In the classroom, teachers would sometimes hand out maybe a copy of a poem, or again, a small part of a book. That gets into that whole Teach Act and some of these other addendums that you've probably heard of. I'm not going to tell you if that's fair use or not, but when you read about it, and there's some links that I have in here where you can read a little bit more about it just to at least get some idea of what's going on. That does start to fall into fair use. Where it really gets murky is when you start getting into media, which is what the Teach Act really was passed to cover, and online materials. Now, this person emailed a permission request to use the material. That's great, as long as they reply back and said, yes, it's great, and you save that permission. But that permission you sent should include what you're going to use, exactly how much, how many people are going to see it, and how long is it that you're going to use it for. That's one of the reasons why online materials get so murky. How do you keep only your students seeing the thing and not Joe Q public from seeing it? Public domain, obvious. If it's public domain, you can use it. And I'll tell you right now, anything that is produced by the US government is public domain. So go crazy with that stuff.
that's not the stuff we want.
That's the problem. Like this image, for instance, is actually from a picture that Ansel Adams took that is now in the public domain.
Beautiful.
So, you know, old stuff like that picture of Hypatia, that's from a painting that's old enough it's in the public domain. Plagiarism is a totally different issue. But as far as reproducing it in that way, that's public domain, so I'm allowed to do it. Commons license, that's not public domain. It's a little better than copyright, you know, complete lockdown copyright. You need to read the license to find out what you can and can't do. Different licenses will allow different things.
Okay, so I have a question then. Maybe I should whisper it. Am I in trouble? I post for my students Langston Hughes, I Too Am American.
You did which?
I post
Mhm.
for my students in an undergrad class, a
Yes.
copy of Langston Hughes, I Too Am America.
That would depend on if it's in public domain or not.
Okay.
Now, you could theoretically
You don't
post
see me tomorrow.
Yeah.
Blank, blank.
Now, some things that are, as I said, are old enough are in the public domain. Prime example is Happy Birthday. As it turns out, that song was public domain for a long time, but it took a court case to prove it.
Oh, how cool.
I remember that. People couldn't sing that song anymore because of the copyright, so it's.
Yeah, it
cool.
turned out that they were wrong.
Gosh.
It is public domain.
I remember.
As I said, Ansel Adams' work, there's another photographer, this came up recently, she donated all of her work to the Library of Congress and placed it into the public domain. And the reason why it came up is there was a image search engine company that was taking her images and then copyrighting them
Gotcha.
and charging for access. As you can see, copyright starts to get very confusing and murky very fast. So the one rule I can tell you that is a good rule to abide by is if it's on the internet, there's probably copyright attached to it somewhere unless it specifically states by the only person that can state this, namely the copyright holder, that it's in public domain.
See, that's so murky.
Yes.
Yeah.
So about the only thing I can guarantee is public domain is government images, and that's by international convention. Namely, images taken by government employees in the course of their work. Like, for instance, that background to that first Padlet, that was taken by a satellite of Jupiter. That's government images from NASA, which, by the way, is a really great collection of images. All right.
So you're ready to go back to the.
Yeah. So third hype for Jane Strudwick's class.
Which one am I?
The one on the right is the presentation.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Now, one of the reasons why I brought this up is we got a question about an item the professor wanted to use in class. What they wanted to do was to copy a book chapter and provide it to their students. And we had to tell them absolutely not. And that is because of one of the items of fair use that says, if it is something that comes up during the course of the class that you think, oh, this will be wonderful to share with my class, and it will be unreasonable to get permission for it, and it's small, and, then it's okay. But if it would be unreasonable or reasonable to ask for permission, and therefore using it would deprive the copyright holder of money, then it is not fair use. And planning to use a book chapter when you're putting together your course to provide to your students would be depriving the author or copyright holder, whoever that might be, of their fees for using the book.
Can I ask, what would be, I know this is probably a legal question, what's considered reasonable?
That's where you'd have to talk to a lawyer.
That seems kind of murky.
Exactly. From what I have seen, and this is just from what I have learned, and I will tell you, I've read books on copyright. I've taken several courses on copyright. I have actually done as much research as you could expect a layperson to do on copyright. And from what I've seen, what they define as reasonable is if you're going to ask copyright permission, it's reasonable to allow time for them to get the request, you know, whether you mail it or email it. You know, if they make the email publicly available, then, you know, email time. Reasonable for them to get time to consider it and then get back to you. So, you know, if you think about it, if you're emailing somebody to ask them something, what would you consider reasonable?
Gotcha.
You know, you send it to them, you give them maybe a day, couple of days to think it over and get back to you. Unreasonable would be where you know, it's come up in class and you just want to show them right now because it would be perfect for the discussion you're working on, and you know you've got the link, you know, like maybe to an online comic or a copy of a book or, you know, a snippet of music or something like that. And if you waited, it would lose its relevance. But again, that's just me as a layperson. You know, you'll get more in the copyright class, and if you're really not sure about it because you come up with these ideas all the time, talk to a lawyer that specializes in copyright. They can give you much better information. Now, why do we go to such extremes? Yes.
We had a question online. How about videos on YouTube? It seems public domain.
YouTube is not public domain unless the owner of the video released it as public domain. That's why YouTube removes videos all the time. The problem is they got so much, and because the law says they are not liable for what people put up, that's why things that aren't public domain get on there all the time.
Yes, that's true.
Now, people do have channels, like Microsoft has a channel they sponsor with videos on how to use their products. That's perfectly acceptable. They've provided it for you to use. They own the copyright for it, and they're saying it's okay.
Isn't it true though that if you link to it, if you just show it, you're not hosting, publishing, or anything?
I wouldn't even go there, to be honest. As I said, with the internet, publishers are starting to get very picky.
Yeah, they are.
And I'll get into the whole story about that in just a minute. So what it comes down to is if you want to do something, please ask us. Like that question, we can research it and at least get back to you with a, well, this is probably what you would encounter or probably what you should do. Okay? And please do not ask a colleague. We get all the time, well, my coworker, my friend, my whoever, who is not a copyright lawyer says it's okay to do this. You know, and you end up with that friend of a friend of a friend thing.
Okay, one more question for now. So for example, if you have a video, I think I spoke to a librarian who said that Disney is very difficult to get like the stuff that you
Oh,
want.
yes. As a matter of fact, they're to blame for this whole mess. I'll talk about that briefly too.
So if you had a video that you wanted to show your students and it's available on YouTube, and you ask the library to get the license for the video and they can't, what's the person to do?
Then your only other option would be if you own a copy of the video,
Oh, okay.
place it on reserve for the students to check out and view at home. Or check and see if the library owns it. We actually own quite a few popular movies.
But it wouldn't be not showing in class.
No. Now, the Teach Act does allow a little bit, but I mean just that, a little bit. Like, for instance, and this is, again, just me saying it from what I understand how the Teach Act works. Like, if you were analyzing, you know, teaching a music class and analyzing popular music, you know, showing Disney's When You Wish Upon a Star, only that little segment and not the whole thing.
My goodness.
They are that strict. And Disney, believe me, they go after everybody. And I'll get to why in a minute. Now, what does FAU do? We take, along with FAU, the most conservative approach. We don't even consider if something can be allowed under fair use. We simply always request copyright, and we require it for anything on course reserves. So unfortunately, if we can't get copyright, we cannot put it on course reserves. We need to come up with alternatives. Why, you ask? This gets into one of the stories I was talking about. The reason why is, as I said, it's complex. It's governed by case law. It's in a state of change right now. Apparently, even the Supreme Court is getting fed up with the state of it. And we don't have a lot of money. Stanford, Harvard, they have a lot of money. We don't. That's Stanford, Harvard, Georgia State University. That's us. In other words, if they sued us for copyright violation, we would probably just cave in and roll over and show our bellies simply because we can't afford to fight it. Now, the reason why I bring up Georgia State University is that this is behind what is a huge change in copyright that's kind of coming down the pike, as it were. A number of years ago, Georgia State University was putting a lot of stuff on eReserve, a lot of online stuff. The publisher, I believe it was Elsevier, saw this in online. They believe me, if it's online, they find it, and sued Georgia State University. Georgia State University has a lot more money than we do. They fought this in court and came to an agreement that they would clean up their eReserve policies, one of which is that if it's online, it can only be seen by the students that are authorized to see it, which is why we don't put stuff on Blackboard, because we cannot prevent other people from putting stuff up. And they went about and they still put things on eReserve. Elsevier wasn't happy about this. They came back and sued Georgia State again. This time it went up through the courts. It went as high as the Supreme Court, who kicked it back to the appellate court, or whatever they call it, the circuit court, or just under the Supreme Court, who reviewed it again, told Elsevier to go, and I will be polite, jump in a lake, said they did not violate copyright, except in a couple of very small instances, I think it was 7 to be exact, and then held Elsevier responsible for all the fees. That was a huge win. The problem is we don't know how it's going to apply to us yet. It's still working its way through the system because it's, as I said, case law. So copyright librarians are still trying to figure out, how does this apply to us, especially with the growth of eReserves and distance learning classes and online resources. So that's one story. And as I said, it's basically why we are so strict when it comes to copyright. The other story is why it's so bad in the first place, and that's Disney. Copyright originally was not meant to be as onerous as it is. It is written into the Constitution, but it was meant to be temporary, so as to foster innovation and change and imagination. Well, then along comes Walt Disney, who creates a little famous character named Mickey Mouse, and creates a couple of wonderful little cartoons back in the late 20s, if I remember right. Everybody loved them, and the company grew. Well, guess what? Long about the 80s, Mickey Mouse's copyright was due to expire. Disney panicked, the company that is. I mean, Walt Disney had died by that time. And got Congress to lengthen it, including for companies. Company copyrights handled a little bit differently than individual copyright. It was due to come up again in the early 2000s. Now Sonny Bono gets involved. Yes, he became a congressman after he finished with his music career, and lengthened it again, 20 years this time. Guess what's due to come up for copyright expiration in a few years? If you want to see fireworks, follow that one. But that's why we have the mess that we do, because of Mickey Mouse. And I can tell you it's not a sure thing that the copyright's going to be extended again, because apparently the Supreme Court, the judges have been starting to grumble about this, that it's starting to get a little too onerous. But you were asking why it's such a mess, and that's why. And just to give you an idea, Sonny Bono's widow, if she had her way, would see copyright extended forever minus a day. And the only reason why it would have to be that is in the Constitution, it says it cannot be forever. So that's pretty much what we're up against. Okay. Now, that's the end of the presentation. I'm going to go through the handouts real quick just so you can see what they are. You're welcome to print them and use them. I have copies I printed out here.
I shared the links online. I shared the links online with
Yeah. This is how the students would access course reserves. And you're welcome to give this out to the students, and we'll be happy to email the instructions to you too if you need them. These are links to where the reserve forms are. As I said, media reserves is actually handled a little bit separately, but it all operates under the same umbrella. These are the contacts. Nikki is my coworker, and Steve Matthew is the head of the department. We can help you with anything that you need. And finally, just some resources that you can go through just to get an idea of what all's involved. I highly recommend the Stanford link. They do a really good job of giving you the basics of how all of this works, especially with regard to teachers and students in academia. Because when you get into copyright for personal usage, like the latest fictional novel, or music, or movies, or that's a whole different ballgame. And is actually one of the reasons why, unless we own music or the video, or have purchased a license to it, we don't even try to get copyright for that stuff because it's so complex. Mainly because you're talking about, instead of one person, the whole team got involved, and they don't necessarily like each other. Another story, there's a CD that I wanted desperately to get a number of years ago. It was an indie group that toured the Renaissance Fair circuit. And they came out with a fantastic CD. The CD sold out, and it went out of print. There was a movement among fans of the group to get the CD reissued. The problem is the group had broken up, and it was a very nasty breakup. The other members of the group were more than willing to work to get the CD back into print, except for one member. And so the CD has never been reissued, and the only way you can get it is if you happen to find a used copy on eBay.
Wow.
That's the problem with music and video, because you have to get, it's basically a committee, and you have to get the whole committee to agree. Unless you happen to know someone who not only wrote and directed, but acted and everything else, or bought out the copyrights for everybody else. So maybe Sam Raimi's first Evil Dead movie might fall into that category, because that was his own complete production. And that's only if he got the copyright from the actors. This is also a good link too. University of Texas does some very good explanations of things. And that's it.
Thank you. It's a wonderful job. Thank you. We appreciate that. It's very, very informative.